All right. So we had three breakout room discussion inquiries on the table. First being, what was the thesis of the reading? Second being, how does Williams produce this problematic about the destruction of Black civilization? And then finally, what do you feel was the greatest contributing factor to the destruction of the Black civilization? Who would like to share?
I'll go first.
Okay.
So basically, what I got, well, when me and my group were talking about, we were talking about like that. Basically, it was like the same thing that the last reading was talking about. It was talking about like racism and stuff, and it was basically the same thing here, but it was just talking about social groups this time. That the African American people were like placed all the way at the bottom. But what we said in our group is like what we liked more about the reading was that they were fighting for it, that they were trying to build their way up, because there's other times that there's not much people that, let's just say, like there's some that protest and there's some that not because they're scared, but they didn't care because they wanted to fight and they had a reason why they were fighting for it. And that's what I liked about the whole entire reading. That's what we got from the reading too.
So what Jaime does very well for us, right, is he shows he's connecting the readings from week to week, right? They're not just isolated readings for him. And what he says, to, if I could paraphrase and put into another word, he's talking about the agency of African people within the text, right? So it does talk about some of the similar stereotypes that were developed in the previous reading, but what Jaime is attentive to is this reading shows African people being actional and the agency within the African people and their desire to fight back against these forces of oppression. A very good call out. Who's next?
Can I chip in?
Yeah, please.
Yeah, so I was actually in his group and I thought he made an amazing point, which was like which you said really like amazingly, because like history kind of tries to take away agency sometimes, and we got to see, it wasn't just European colonization, it was, a lot of different forces, a lot of different factors, and even so, you know, they still weren't the people that, like supremacist narratives try to paint them as, even with all of these like factors that, that we're learning about.
Yeah, thank you.
And yeah.
Yeah, you don't comment much, Lee, but when you do comment, you offer very nuanced and perspective insight. So I do appreciate that. Let's get one more and we'll move on to my notes.
I guess I can go. I know that in our group, Antonia had a very good examination of it, and she had, I forgot how she worded it, like, but she had pretty much just said that like one of the leading causes and like one of the, like the best contributing, not the best, but one of the leading contributing factors in the destruction of Black civilization was the lack of resources. And she had said, and I believe the statistic was that it was due to like their lack of resources, that the like population size in Africa was cut by 1/3, I believe.
Mm-hmm.
So like obviously from that, it's very clear that it's like, that's definitely probably one of the biggest contributors in that sense.
And I think also to tie this conversation around resources, right? It was also this notion of nature, because of where they were looking at and they were located in the proximity to desert, right? Resources were limited because they were battling being forced into the desert regions when a lot of the visiting cultures came in and established themselves along the borderlands, along the trade routes, and along the seaports, right? So this also contributes to this notion of the restriction of resources. So very good call out. Did anyone discuss? You don't have to go into too much detail, but I'm curious. Did anyone discuss the question of the how? Right, like how does Williams produce this text, the destruction of Black civilization? Some of his methods. Another way to think about the how is what was his methodology of producing the text? Did anybody talk about that in their group?
Um, I really liked how he provided data, scientific data and facts when talking about, I remember it was, I wrote about, okay, that all these factors that, all the factors that like malnutrition, famine, and everything reduced the Black population by 3/4. That really stood out for me because it was such a large amount.
People.
Yeah.
Yeah. Very good call out, Antonia. And you're also right in the sense of how comprehensive the text was, right? A lot of statistical data, and there's a lot of topography. And when I say like topography, I just mean like he's talking about how the land is constructed, right? He's talking about the desert regions. He's talking about the seaports and things of this nature. So there's a very keen awareness to how the landmass is structured, right? So thank you all for sharing. So to jump into my notes, the name of the book was The Destruction of Black Civilizations, Great Issues of the Race from 4,500 BC to 2000 AD. So we know that this is the time period that Williams will be looking at. What I had you all read was the overview, right? This is the introductionary chapter of the text. And there's really two purposes why I had you read the overview. One, it's very instructive in in developing, what he wants to do and laying out a very brief overview of some of the forces that led to the destruction of Black civilization, right? So that's one thing. But, so that's the what, right? Y'all with me on that? So one of the aspects of this reading is what is being talked about. How did African people go from this to this, right? So that's one aspect of the reading. But for me, which is more interesting, is the how. And this is something to kind of to what Antonio is talking about in the sense of the data that he's able to kind of gather and present, right? So a lot of my conversation within this text is going to deal with the question of how. And I want you as scholars to begin to think about this idea of how as you begin to start reading not only the text in my class, but the text in all of your courses, right? Because this is what could happen. It's very likely that you may not agree with some of the material that you come across, right? Especially for people of culture who are in fields like anthropology and things of this nature, some of your classic philosophies, right? You may not necessarily agree with what's being said, right? But what you can do is be attentive to how they're saying it. And you can start to adapt some of their methodologies in presenting information and being able to take your what, but using their how. Does that make sense? Somebody try to explain to me what I'm trying to articulate. I want to make sure you're catching up the point.
Professor, I don't even know what you said. It's loud over here. I can't even hear you.
So there's a distinction between the what and the how, okay? The what is what is being said, what is being talked about. So within this reading, Chancellor Williams is talking about African in Africa being destabilized. So that's the what, that's the subject matter, right? But what I'm interested in is how he talks about Africa being destabilized, right? The information that he uses, the sources that he uses, his method of going about to gather the information, right? This is the how. This becomes important as thinkers, as scholars, because you may not always agree with what is being said, right? What is being said may portray your people in a negative light, right? It may not speak to your agency as a people. But what possibly may be useful is how these thinkers say what they're saying, the style of argumentation that they use, right? So it's very rare as people of culture especially that you agree with everything that you come across within the spaces of academia, right? It's very rare, especially if you're a conscious individual occupying a white body, right? You may not agree with everything that you hear. But what you can agree with is how they go about their argumentation, right? So as scholars, I want you to be able to be attentive to not only what is being said, but how they're saying it. Not only what they're arguing, but how they're arguing, right? If we could put it into a musical context, right? And if you are to look at rap, right? There's what Jay-Z talks about, right? There's the content of his lyrics that makes him a proficient lyricist, right? but then there's also the style that he delivers these lyrics with as well. Y'all with me on that? Does the parallel make sense? Right? So as someone who's a fan of music, you can listen to what is being said and be like, yo, this is dope. This is why I like this particular artist, right? Or you can say, yo, I like how this artist says what they say. And you may not necessarily agree with what they're saying, right? But how they say it is super, it speaks to you in a certain way. For example, right? And y'all might not even know this reference, but I grew up in Pomona. So there's an artist named Sugar Free, right? If you know DJ Quick, you may be familiar with Sugar Free. What he talks about is abhorrent. I can't, it's very misogynistic, very sexist, right? But how he says it, I can't front. It's my guilty pleasure. It does something to me, right? So again, I just bring this up to say you have to also be attentive to the how. Can someone try to paraphrase for me what I'm trying to get you to understand? I just want to make sure that you're getting the point.
I got you. So basically, you're trying to ask us to essentially read between the lines of like understand like the words that the authors that we are reading, like what we're doing, like not necessarily like information that they're being asked, yeah, we should know that, but specifically like what words they use, how they articulate their thoughts, like if they do in first person, third person, like what words they use specifically, like that's what we should be looking for.
Absolutely. Thank you, Michael. So this implicit, very careful read of not only, again, what is being said, but how it's being said, the articulation style and the word choice. Absolutely. Okay, so let's get into my notes. He says at the top of the, towards the bottom of the page 44, yet the very heart of the land of the race, yet the very heartland of the race, right, and the cradle of civilization were actually further south below the first cataract. So what he's talking about is the origins of civilization, right? And he's saying that it's often argued that Kemet is the origin of civilization, right? Egypt is the origin of civilization. But he says, no, this is not the fact. If you really study history, you know that a lot of these things that make this civilization great come from a southern region, which you would call Nubia, right? And he says that's on the lower part of the first cataracts. And what a cataract is, so if you look at the Nile Valley, right, and it's the largest river in the world, and there's cataracts that break up the Nile Valley. And what a cataract is, it's a body of boulders that are placed together that kind of make a partition in the Nile Valley, right? And he's saying that the first cataract is where, below the first cataract, is where you'll find the civilization of Nubia. And Nubia is responsible for a lot of the knowledge, a lot of the spirituality that you find central in Kemet, right? So this is his argument. He says, in short, okay, and then so now he's talking about this idea of migration, right? And because of the Arab enslavement trade, right? Because if you read closely, you know that there's also, before even Europeans got into Africa, he's saying that the slave trade, the enslavement of Africans was done by Arabs, right? And he's saying that as they try to flee this persecution and this enslavement, they begin to migrate, right? And he's saying that this idea that they could not build civilization is a false idea because they're on the run, right? So for them being on the run, they don't have the ability to set up these large buildings and these large buildings and these long established buildings. So what they choose to do are build little huts that could be teared down easily, taken with them as they migrate further, right? So what he says is, in short, they could build large, steady, attractive compounds, homes, and temples of worship, or easily demolish huts, right? So they have the ability to do both. Either these really large, elaborate buildings, temples, etc., or these easily broke down huts that allows them to migrate, right? The question whether to build the sturdy infrastructure or the huts was centered around how many miles they were able to put between themselves and the enslavers who were trying to capture them, right? So if they felt like they were able to establish a great distance between themselves and those who were trying to enslave them, then they may build more established infrastructure, right? But if they felt like the distance between the enslaver and themselves was not great, they had to build these little huts that they would be easily able to tear down and take with them on their next journey, right? So this idea of migration becomes very central to the livelihood and the lifestyles of African people, okay? He talks about the effects of fragmentation and isolation. Again, thinking about migration, right? It's very impractical. So it's 40 of us in this class total, right? If we were to come under assault as a class and we had to disperse as a class, it's less practical for all 40 of us to move together, right? We can move a lot easily if we were to break off maybe in groups of 5, right? So this is the rationale behind Africans as they're doing this migration, right? They felt like it would be easier for them to travel this way. So Chancellor Williams is going to talk about some of the consequences of this migration. One is the development of over 2,000 languages, right? So as they broke up into these different groups established their own forms of communication, right? And this splintering would lead to the establishing of over 2,000 languages, right? And so what he also argues is the second contributing factor of isolation and fragmentation is that not only does the distance create the separation, right? Because let's just say that myself, Melanie, Perla, and Lee are gonna take our group and go east, and Cole, JW, and Michael are gonna take their group and go west, right? So distance is creating a separation, right? Not only is it the distance that creates the separation, the language on top of that. So my group speaks a certain language, Akan, right? And Cole's group speaks Igbo. So not only are we separated by a distance, now we're linguistically separated. So these are the two contributing factors, according to Williams, that was stemmed from the fragmentation and isolation. Then he makes a very, very clear and explicit claim, right? And he says, for what happened, very simply, was that European imperialism in Africa checked and replaced Arab imperialism, right? So all the work that we understand that Europe had done to contribute to the destruction of Africa, right, is simply replacing the same type of destruction that was being done by Arab imperialism into Africa. The same type of critique that we talk of Christianity's role in destabilizing African spirituality and African religion, we can argue Islam had the same type of devastating effect on Africa as well, right? So this is the claim that Williams is making within that claim, within that argument, right? So again, when you talk about how, it's pointing to us. One is disturbing our understanding of history, right? This idea of problematization. So conventionally, we think of the only people to kind of establish themselves in Africa on an imperialistic basis is Europe, right? That's conventional wisdom. But Chancellor Williams is saying if you do a very thorough study of history, right, you'll know that there were Arab groups that came in and did the exact same, or even some could argue, a more disastrous effect in Africa than Europeans, right? So you talk about how part of his method is to disrupt how we think about history, especially as it relates to Africa, right? And in doing so, he's going to show you that this was not just a phenomenon that happened without pushback, right? African people did not just allow their areas to be taken over. They fought for these areas back. Again, disturbing the way that we think we understand the history of African people. So part of his method, right, is problematization. It's the disturbing normal understandings of this version of history. Another issue that created problems for Africa, he says that Kemet was recognized as the breadbasket of the world, right? And because of where it was situated along the Nile, because of the temperature that it had, right, it was perfect for vegetation. So people from Europe, people from Asia, people from Arabic countries came and located there. And as I mentioned earlier, they would situate themselves along the trade post, and they would situate themselves along the coast, right? Um, Initially, African people did not view this as a problem. By nature, African people were traders. So they allowed them to come into the ports, excuse me, and establish themselves there because in the African people's mind, right, this is easier for trading, right? And this also allows them easy access back to their home. There was no concept in these people's mind that these people who they're allowing to be on these ports will stay there forever, right? That wasn't even in their thinking. Another issue that law caused for the destruction of Black civilization, right? When these other groups were established themselves on the port, we had mixing and mingling of the different ethnic groups, right? He talks about how the Arab and Asian groups would marry into these African groups, right, and try to establish their themselves within the families, right? And then when the mixed offspring would be produced, they would place in their mind that their African mother was below their European, Arabic, or Asian father, right? And they would use these offspring to engage in practices of war and in practices of enslaving other Africans, right? So think about this if we're being critical. This idea and argument that you often hear as it pertains to enslavement in Africa, right, is that Africans were selling themselves into slavery, right? That's an argument that you hear. But if you read closely to what Chancellor Williams is saying, he's saying 9 times out of 10, what it would be is a lot of these offsprings of mixed relationships would go in here and do the capturing, right? Not to mention what he also argues is the concept of enslavement that the Africans viewed was not the same. But to be fair, right, he does say that this is one of the things that causes the destruction of Black civilization as well, is African chiefs engaging in the practice of selling African people who've been captured by war, right? So he doesn't allow African people to be off the hook in their own destruction. All right. And then I think he closes with some very good questions. And I want to just read a couple of those. 1 second. Okay. So I'm looking at the bottom of page, well, the final paragraph before the preconditions for progress on page 53. He poses this question. How, then, were the Blacks able to battle invading enemies from one end of the continent to the other for several thousand years? True, they were overcome in the end, but what sustained them through all those centuries of struggle on so many different fronts and against so many different kind of enemies? Weakened so generally by both disease and what became perpetual hunger, whence came their strength and courage to carry on? It may well be that the answers lie in the death-defying pyramids they built in Egypt when the land was theirs, right? So, but to me, what's more fecund, what's more important is the question, how are African people able to sustain themselves after battling nature, after battling European invasion, after battling Asian invasion, after battling Arabic invasion, right? But they're still able to withstand, they're still able to be here, right? So this is the question to me that becomes very important. Yeah, we'll put a pin on my notes there and we'll transition into our fishbowl. So again, you know, you have 2 fishbowls per semester. You could talk about my notes. You could talk about the breakout room conversation. You could talk about the reading itself. All that's on the table. You could literally read your journal. Is there anyone who wants to volunteer to fishbowl?
Yeah, I'll go.
Okay, we got Lee and Jaime and Michael. Okay, bet. 1 second. So we got Lee, Jaime, and Michael. And whoever wants to start off, it's on you.
I'll start off. Y'all can hear me, right? Okay. So I was saying before when I was talking about that I basically was putting it there that from the last reading and this reading was basically I read like the same thing, but how I see it is that like it's a question I got. It's like don't why don't put why do the African American people don't step up in some situations when it benefits them, but step up when it doesn't benefit them sometimes and stuff. Like I see that a lot of times around where I live at, that like where they should step up, they don't do it. But when what's it called, they step up when they don't have to do it. And that's basically what I got from the reading. That they were basically what I'm trying to say is that in this reading that they were like in the social group all the way to the bottom, didn't see themselves as like normal people and stuff. And like how I see it was that I like how they were stepping up, that they didn't care who was in the way, that they were working themselves up there. And what you said too in the beginning, I forgot what you said. You said something about I forgot what you said, but that's basically what I got.
I'm gonna circle back to you, Jaime, at the end of the breakout room. Leah, Michael, one of you two are next.
So can I talk about something that might be like a little tangential? So I'm taking a class with another professor in this department, and he actually has been talking about like the Black church and how a lot of people, especially scholars, criticize it, but in his opinion, it's like it's a powerful institution, and it's an institution that can do a lot of good. And you've been talking at the same time about how you know religion like Christianity or Islam, it might not necessarily be like blaming the religion directly, but it has a really complicated history. So I guess I had more of a question than a discussion of like how like how you can know this history and how you're supposed to kind of come to grips with it, especially if you practice this religion.
Fuck, huh? That's how you gonna do, Lee? Are you gonna drop that type of question on us? I'm gonna address your question because it's a really deep question, and it's something even myself, growing up in a Christian home, I had to struggle with, right? So I'm gonna let Michael go, and then I'm gonna work through. I'll probably work through your question last, just because it's such a expansive question.
Okay, thank you, Professor.
I bet. Is my audio okay?
Yeah, you're good.
All right, good. Solid. All right. So what I wanted to talk about is essentially the third question, breakout question. It was, in your opinion, what was the greatest contributing factor of the disruption of Black civilization? So I remember, crap, I forgot it. I think it was JW. I think he was talking about how there's a lack of resources. But for me personally, what I really was interested in was the like inside like black on black sharing them. I have a quote that said like greed from advanced societies led to the undermining of their own allies, destroying that sense of community and kinship. That I feel like that is the greatest, because we talked about in the first week with Patali's readings. That was literally the fundamentals and core of civilization. They always wanted the sense of unity in that community aspect, and now we're seeing that with the conversions of Christianity, or the essentially the colonialization and imperialization, that is pretty much like going away. Like that whole ideologies from before, I feel like that's the like at that point you see that that's basically done deal. Like it's like once you see that whole core commonality from before is essentially changing to greed, to power, to what you see in that because of the conquest of like religion, it's essentially that is the greatest contributing factor of the destruction.
Yeah. First of all, y'all did your thing on this fishbowl. Okay. And I would also argue, Michael, not only is that the greatest contributing factor to the destruction of Black civilization, I would argue that that's the greatest contributing factor to civilization as a whole, right? This idea of materialism, this idea of greed, this idea of myself before anyone else. That's something that not only ill impacted Black folks and African folks, it ill impacted white folks, it ill impacted folks from the Asian community, folks from the Arabic community. Like that, to me, is one of the core factors that really erodes the fabric of our society. So I think that you're spot on in your views of how it impacted this particular community. But if we are to expand that, you see how that's the same cancer that's really making us all stabilized. Yeah, so that's a very good call out. I'm gonna save Lee for last. I had a question for Jaime though, because he says he's curious as to there's certain times where he sees this African community advocate for themselves and step up, and then there's certain times where he feels like they should be doing that, and he doesn't see those responses. So I'm curious if Jaime can provide more specified examples to where he feels like the African community should be stepping up and they're not doing so. You feel me, Jaime?
Okay, yeah. So it's like, let's just say, for example, I've seen, let's just say, I've seen a African American person with a white folk. Let's just say it was like they were outside my my food place and stuff, like out the dirt. And what I seen was that he shouldn't even never done that. That the white folk was offering him, I don't know what he was offering him, but he was offering something. And what's it called? The guy goes, the African American goes to him and stuff, which he should have never done. And then he gets punched in the face for no reason, basically. But like he should have never went to him and stuff, because he was basically trying to like offer him like a fight, I guess. But like he should have just ignored that white person. But I heard him like screaming and stuff. I don't know what he was doing, but it was weird. And then what I seen, like when they have to like step up and stuff, what I seen was the movement that they stepped up, and that's when they had to step up. And there's sometimes when they don't have to step up and they do it still.
Okay, so maybe correct me if I'm wrong in my paraphrasing, right? So oftentimes when there's opportunities for individuals to step up and defend themselves, they don't take that opportunity. But what he notices as a community, when it's time for the Black folks, for the African community to step up, they would do this as a collective base. Is that kind of what you're getting at, Jaime?
Exactly okay. Like that.
Yeah, you know, I can't. You're right, bro. You're right, and you're right from a couple of aspects, right? Even if you were to take, not focus it from the African standpoint, right? I'm putting on mute.
Yeah. Oh, my bad.
Right. Even if we are to not focus it from just the African standpoint, right? From a standpoint of power, it's hard for one person to go up against a power group, because let's just say, for example, that in this circumstance that the Black dude was the aggressor and he punched the white dude in the face, right? Very easily, what could the white dude do? Call police. And that whole situation is totally different, right? So he may not have had the wherewithal to feel that was a wise thing to do, because he doesn't have the power to support him, right? But when you're moving as a whole collective group, you're able to advocate for yourself in ways that your power could be recognized. So I think that's oftentimes why you see individuals will have to acquiesce to the power in that moment because they're powerless, you know? So that's how I would answer that. And I think too, there's something to be said of what you're attentive to, the fact that I don't even know why he approached him. You know what I mean? Like at certain levels, you got to kind of leave some shit alone, right? So I think there's some truth to that also. To get to Lee's point, and I'm gonna go on a limb and assume that Lee's professor is Dr. James Thomas. Am I correct, Lee?
Yes. So yeah.
Okay. So this is what I'll say about Dr. James Thomas and his intellectual and ideological relationship to Christianity. Okay. I'm gonna throw out some names. You may be familiar with them, you may not. Martin Luther King, Denmark Vesey, Nat Turner, Gabriel Prosser, right? These are individuals who were preachers who were stone cold motherfucking revolutionaries, right? Like Nat Turner led one of the greatest rebellions of enslaved Africans on this continent, but he was a preacher, right? And Nat Turner's message was God told him to take the heads of these enslavers, right? Not to fight back, but to take the heads of these enslavers. It's the message from the divine God, right? And this is during this ideological framework that is known as liberation theology, right? So yeah, I'm going to talk about the Bible, and I'm going to talk about Christianity, and I'm going to talk about Jesus, but I'm going to use this text in a way that's going to get us free and not to further perpetuate our enslavement, right? So Dr. Thomas, for me, he speaks in alignment with this tradition, right? Even if we are to use the work of Dr. Martin Luther King, yes, he's nonviolent, right? Yes, he's Christian, but he's using these theological works to advocate for African people getting free, right? It's not to say that you should just continue to serve your master and be oppressed. That's not how Dr. King was using the Bible, right? He was using the Bible to say, yo, we deserve our human rights, right? So this is, again, under this branch of thinking that's called liberation theology. So for me, if you're going to engage this idea of Christianity, that's the only way to do it. And that's the only way to reconcile the contradiction that Lee's attentive to of the historical practices of how Christianity has impacted African people, right? And the possibilities and the potentialities of what Christianity could be to help liberate African people. For me, Lee, that's the only way to situate or settle that contradiction. Because if you're not engaging in liberation theology as a Christian, I don't know what the fuck you're doing, right? And to further problematize or further complicate your question, I would have a more, for me, what's become more of a question for those who practice that is how do you separate the image of God, right, that looks like your oppressor, and how do you not view that as a form of mental colonization and spiritual oppression, right? To me, that's more of the fecund question. Because even if you're practicing and engaging in liberation theology, but you're praying to a blonde-haired, blue-eyed Jesus, that's a contradiction, right? Because your, who is it, Amos Wilson, I believe it says, your image of God will determine your ability to realize who you are as yourself. And if your image of God does not look like you, you're going to have a warped sense of self, right? So that's my long-winded approach to answer your question, Lee. I don't know if that's sufficient for you.
Yeah, so no, that made a lot of sense. So if I'm right, you're kind of talking about like taking something that was used negatively and using it as empowerment and redefining what it can be in the future as long as you're doing it the right way. And that can I go on? Oh yeah. Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense to me, especially since Christianity was not originally like a European religion. You know, it just because it was used in a bad way doesn't mean people should not be able to connect with religion, because it's important spiritually.
Yep.
So yeah, thank you. That really answered my question.
Yeah, I think that's a really good question that you posed. And I think anyone, right, that's engaged in any religious practice should ask those type of questions of yourself, right? Not even make it about anyone else, but of yourself. You must always start with an internal critique before you start to bring this critique outside of yourself. I'm curious to hear other thoughts about the readings. Any other questions, comments, or concerns you all may have, especially from the sisters in the class, because y'all been kind of quiet today. Melanie, Perla, Antonia, you haven't been speaking, so I thank you for that. But I'm curious to hear what the women think also. So Perla, what are your thoughts on the conversation or the reading? Perla, you there? How many you gonna say something?
Perla says that she's on campus and like it's really loud where she is, so she can't use her mic.
Gotcha.
Oh, were you calling me?
No. But you can speak if you like to. Go ahead.
Oh.
You have
Oh,
any?
Carla. Oh, I'm sorry.
Okay. All right. So again, I'm just looking for comments, questions, concerns, thoughts about the reading. Um, anyone who has not spoke up much, I'd like to hear from
Um, I I'm gonna be honest. I didn't really do the reading yet. I was gonna do it today, but then I found out we have to come to class because I'm the part of the B group. But I did skim over it, and I realized that the way the writing goes, it's almost like environmental. Like you get a lot of like a geography kind of aspect. Um, like literally everything he writes, it's like, it's like talks about the craters, the land, how it is, where it's located, how it's like, north, south. Like there's so much, it's like you don't need to really um you don't have to really like believe what he's saying, but it comes in such a logical understanding with just the environment alone. Like you don't have to like question it. It's kind of like it's already there. Like, if you know simple geography, it's like, oh, that's where it's located. And this is, it makes sense now. It's kind of like, okay, well, it's like the center of the earth kind of, and it's like you have all these different types, it's like, and I also wanted to talk about I feel like religion in general definitely changed things up. And it's crazy to actually think about it as like Christianity and Islam are almost like in a race to just adopt as many people as possible.
Mm-hmm.
And I also feel like religion nowadays has created kind of like a sense of like a belonging somewhere, like to have like a word, it's kind of like a political party,
Yeah.
either you're Democratic or Republican. I mean, that's the only way someone's going to listen to you.
Yeah.
If you're part of the other 50 other parties that no one really like cares about or something, like no one's really going to listen to you. So it's like, oh, like it's like you want to fit into society. Well, you need to have a religion.
Yeah.
If you don't, then everyone's just gonna be like, oh, you don't have a religion. Like even a religion I don't agree with, but at least like I'd like, oh, you're religious.
Right.
Like there's some sort of common ground. But if you're not religious, society kind of frowns upon that, and it's hard to fit in, especially in a society like a social construct that's been developed for so many years.
And I
Yeah.
think, too, to your point, Carney, it's gotten so bad and so pervasive to where if you say that you're non-religious, it's almost assumed that you're atheist, right? And like the two are, it's not mutually exclusive, right? You can be non-religious and still believe in God, right? So I think you bring up a really good point.
Yeah, it's really interesting. It's almost like, and you could relate that, to the past. Like I'm pretty sure it's like, I mean, some people must have been like, oh, like, well, if you just say we're part of this religion, then we're backed up by this religious group that's already like kind of like invading us, or like it's like, okay, like we'll take care of you. Like, I'm pretty sure like, they showed like, oh, you don't want to follow our beliefs, like this is what happens. I mean, back then it was a lot more, in your face kind of thing. So like very forceful.
Yeah.
So I think that has kind of followed us up till now. Like we still, I think, subconsciously believe like if we're not, if we're not going with the wave of society, like we're gonna crash.
Yeah.
And like, we kind of accept like we're supposed to crash, like we kind of like hurt ourselves inside, I think.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a very good point. I'm looking at the chat, and I think Melanie brings up a really good point. Um, she's saying how religion is used kind of in line with our conversation, but she talks about the Aztecs um, and other native groups, right, or other indigenous groups, and I think that's a very profound point. Most of us are from California, if not all of us, right? I believe it's fourth grade. And they had you all do what they call the mission project. Am I wrong? Y'all remember that? Kind of, right? And you had to go down. They had you build a mission, and then if you're lucky, you get to go visit a mission. So like this is what the equivalent of that experience would be for African people, right? So if they would have to do this project for Black folks, right, it would be the equivalent of us building a plantation, right, and then going to visit a plantation, right? Because if you know anything about these missions and their mission schools for Native people, if you spoke a Native language, they fucking you up, right? If you display a Native haircut, they fucking you up. You wear Native clothes, they're fucking you up. They will literally beat the indigenousness out of you until you presented yourself as Christian or as European as possible, right? So that's why I equate this idea of a mission, an experience that the mission produced for indigenous people, to what African people went through on the plantation. The intentions of those two institutions are exactly the same, right? To beat your native culture and your humanity out of you, right? So when you talk about religion, and especially for indigenous people, man, here in this, especially in California, right? You cannot separate the devastation of that Catholic Church. And if you really want to get sick with it, start researching how much land the Catholic Church owns in California. We talk about power, right? You want to really look into some shit. So that's a very good call out, Melanie. Any other last comments, questions, or concerns before we close out for the day? Okay. If you guys can, 4 p.m. Zoom, we'll be in conversation on Afrofuturism. I think we've gotten to that conversation a little bit today implicitly if you were paying attention when I talked about the potentialities of what religion could be in the future, right? And how it could be used if it's not used as an oppressive force. And really this idea of Afrofuturity or Afrofuturism is African people imagining what the future could look like without the constrictions of systems of oppression, or if we are able to dismantle systems of oppressions, what type of future can be built, right? And I'll kind of get into some of the major thinkers, some of the major progenitors of this thought, some of the major artists of this movement. Yeah, so if you can make it, I think it'll be a really fruitful conversation. I know that most of you were from Wednesday's course. If you can make Wednesday's course, I still encourage you to attend because the conference will be really dope, and I think you should all take advantage of that. So hopefully I'll be able to see you all on Wednesday. And if not, holler at me if you have any questions, comments, or concerns. For next week, we're reading Ivan Van Sertima, They Came Before Columbus. Ivan Van Sertima, They Came Before Columbus. That's available for you on the Google Classroom site. But if not, I'll email that out to you all by Thursday or Friday. All right. Y'all have a good one. Be healthy, be wealthy, be wise. You have a question, Michael? Okay. Be healthy, be wealthy, be wise. Take care of y'all family. Peace.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, Zori. All right, Michael. All right. Jaime, you good, bro?
Yeah, what's up? No, yeah, I'm good. It's just I'm in campus right now.
Yeah. How that feel for you?
Huh?
That feel?
It's cool. It's cool. It's cool, but it's like low key. There's some awkward people here. Like they don't just say or anything. They don't know how to talk. Like I was trying to make a conversation with some girl that had an English class and stuff. She was the most awkward ass person that I ever met in my damn life.
People been inside for a long time, bro. They may have forgot how to socially engage other people. I mean, we're in a weird time right now.
I know, but like still though, like you're already growing enough to like for you to not to be like shy and stuff. Like, come on, like we in college. Like you're gonna have to get out of that comfort zone either way.
This is true. This is true.
But that's what